Hello. Do we have contact? No?
Hello, Jason. I'm here. I can see and hear you fine.
Okay, wonderful. We have you. We were just slightly panicking there for a moment. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name's Jason Barker. Welcome to the College of Foreign Language and Literature here at Kyunghee University and Manifestos for an International University. This is week 4 in our symposium. Please check our website if you don't know anything about us. There's a bit more information that you can find there. This is not a university.com. And not a lot more information. I mean, the best way to find out what we're doing is to sort of tune in and watch the videos and join us live if you can. I should say that for any Korean speakers, there is a Korean translation of today's text available on YouTube. You can watch us live, as some of you I know already are on YouTube. And there is a Korean translation of today's talk there available for you. You can download it, follow the link, and you can download it freely. Without further ado, let me introduce to you today's guest. I'm delighted to have Alberto Toscano on the line, who is a reader in critical theory and co-director of the Centre for Philosophy and Critical Thought at Goldsmiths, University of London. He is visiting faculty at the School of Communication, Simon Fraser University in British Columbia. He is the author of Cartographies of the Absolute with Jeff Kinkle and Fanaticism on the Uses of an Idea, of which there is a Korean translation. I know that for a fact. Other translations too, but there is a Korean translation available of the book. And finally, he is a member of the editorial board of the journal Historical Materialism. I should also add that Alberto is the translator of several works by the French philosopher Alain Badiou, including one of Badiou's major works, Logics of Worlds. So I'm delighted he's here, and I'll just say now, Alberto, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Jason. It's a real pleasure to be able to participate in this initiative, and I have very fond memories indeed of presenting that Korean edition of Fanaticism a few years back, and hope virological conditions permitting, I'll be able to make a repeat visit. Not least as I find myself now on the Pacific, so a little bit easier. Now, this talk, whose title is On the Good Use of Ruins, Critical Theory and the University's Extrema Ratio, is actually a further iteration, a version of a talk whose first incarnation was actually in the wake of the movement to resist the imposition of draconian university fees in the United Kingdom in 2010. And in fact, an earlier version of this was published 10 years ago in a volume called The Assault on Universities, whose subtitle was indeed a manifesto for resistance. The paper's seen a number of different iterations in other contexts. So I wrote a version of it for a Spanish and Chilean volume called Concepts to Dissolve the Capitalist University, and for a volume for an independent art institute that I collaborate with in Lisbon in Portugal, Mamaus. So I've tried to adapt somewhat this text to the circumstances of this sequence of manifestos. And I'll begin. And but before I begin, I also wanted to thank everybody whose technical work and is making this possible there, whether it's sound, image, or whatever the spatial conditions are for keeping this going, and also to note my envy for being in the physical space of the university, something which at times I escape or abhor, but that now seems positively utopian. I was speaking with a friend about how we long to be stuck in elevators with colleagues who dislike making chit-chat after so much time of enclosure. Okay, so I'll begin. Is it possible to democratize higher learning, at once debasing and revaluing it? This question, which has elicited divergent answers and numerous practical experiments over the past 4 or 5 decades, was put back on the agenda by the student movements that erupted worldwide in the wake of the financial crisis of 2007-8, from France to Chile, Puerto Rico to the United Kingdom, and beyond. The parameters for interrogating the nexus of democracy and higher education have also changed. The so-called mass university of the 1960s and 1970s, this was at least terminology current in Italy at the time, is not the corporate university of today, just as the apparently virtuous pattern of growth that underlay an earlier expansion of higher education contrasts with a kind of zombie neoliberalism that imposes austerity without being able to sell the idea of a real recovery to come. Inasmuch as university remains, whether we like it or not, the principal, not necessarily the best site for the production of anything that might claim the mantle of critical theory, it is not otiose to reflect on the staggered dialectic driving the relation between, on the one hand, the philosophical interpretation of capital's negativity, what I take to be the core intuition or the core problem of critical theory, and on the other, that supremely ambiguous institution which has served as the locus for reproducing capitalism's managers and minions while enduringly imagining itself as a space in which the imperatives and instrumentalities of the market are suspended, i.e., the university. We could indeed periodize critical theory itself, arising as it did in a singular institution outside the state university, the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research, yet living on within it, also in terms of its relation to the insurgencies of intellectual labor that marked the post-war period. That the student movements of the 1960s were largely gestated within the bosom of critical theory is a well-known tale, as is the recognition that the German student movement, in particular, had a rather parricidal attitude towards its forebears, finding its echoes in recurrent Habermasian asseverations against left fascism, or the tragicomic scene of the so-called Busenattentat or breast attack during a lecture by Theodor Adorno shortly before his death. Anecdotes aside, it may be argued that critical theory's relation to the university, its contradictions in its movements, as well as to education, schooling, and pedagogy more broadly, is centrally a matter of the meanings according to the concept or the notion or even the word democracy. This is evident both before and in the wake of the so-called explosion of '68. For Adorno himself, the question of education after Auschwitz was always entangled with a thinking of democracy as something other than an administered amnesia perfectly compatible with the reign of the commodity and the impunity of domination. In a 1959 conference, Adorno declared that, I quote, "I consider the survival of National Socialism within democracy to be potentially more menacing than the survival of fascist tendencies against democracy." Crucially for Adorno, the insistence of fascist tendencies through forgetting was not a matter of German psychopathology, of a particular capitalist social structure and social unconscious. As he notes, the atrophy of historical consciousness that makes the living on of Hitlerism possible is, I quote, necessarily connected to the advancement of the bourgeois principle. Bourgeois society is universally situated under the law of exchange. The like for like
Alberto?
of a capitalist. Yes?
That's the sound has gone slightly. I don't know if you can maybe possibly now adjust your mic. Maybe it's gone. The sound went very low for a moment there. I'm just wondering if
very low.
That's perfect there.
Okay, so it's just a matter of my distance from
the mic. It might have been.
Okay.
It might have been. Yeah, please. Maybe go back a paragraph. That's great. Thanks.
Sure.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in a 1959 conference, does that sound okay?
That's good.
Yeah.
That's good.
In a 1959 conference, Adorno declared that, quote, I consider the survival of National Socialism within democracy to be potentially more menacing than the survival of fascist tendencies against democracy. Crucially for Adorno, the insistence of fascist tendencies through forgetting was not a matter of German psychopathology, but of a particular capitalist social structure and social unconscious. As he notes, the atrophy of historical consciousness that makes the living on of Hitlerism possible, quote, is necessarily connected to the advancement of the bourgeois principle. Bourgeois society is universally situated under the law of exchange, of the like for like of accounts that match and that leave no remainder. In its very essence, exchange is something timeless. Like ratio itself, like the operations of mathematics according to their pure form, they remove the aspect of time. To employ the language of a marginal figure within the Frankfurt School galaxy, Alfred Sonnrettel, whose philosophical intuitions about capitalism were deeply impactful on Adorno, the persistence of fascism within democracy is a matter of capitalism's real abstractions, as mediated by mass psychology. For Adorno, there is an intimate solidarity between the internalization of incapacity, transmitted by a dominant individualist ideology, and the compensatory collective fantasies that come to be realized in and by fascist movements. The latter, in keeping with Freud's pioneering analyses, are driven by forms of collective narcissism that continue their secret life notwithstanding fascism and Nazism's spectacular defeats. Adorno's analysis remains powerful and incisive in our own times of late fascism. As Adorno continues, quote, the economic order, and to a great extent also the economic organization modeled upon it, now as then renders the majority of people dependent upon conditions beyond their control, and thus maintains them in a state of political immaturity. If they want to live, then no other avenue remains but to adapt, submit themselves to the given conditions. They must negate precisely that autonomous subjectivity to which the idea of democracy appeals. They can preserve themselves only if they renounce their self. To see through the nexus of deception, they would need to make precisely that painful intellectual effort that the organization of everyday life, and not least of all, a culture industry inflated to the point of totality, prevents. The necessity of such adaptation, of identification with the given, the status quo, with power as such, creates the potential for totalitarianism. This potential is reinforced by the dissatisfaction and the rage that very constraint to adopt produces and reproduces. Because reality does not deliver the autonomy or ultimately the potential happiness that the concept of democracy actually promises, people remain indifferent to democracy if they do not in fact secretly detest it. End of quote. Yet when a student movement did emerge in the mid-1960s seeking to enact the democratic pedagogic practice that Adorno had called for, a practice able to operate at the level of capital and fantasy, real abstraction and mass psychology alike, it was in ways that came into ideological and institutional conflict with Adorno's thought and person. For Adorno, pedagogy qua critical theory demanded a turn, however twisted, to the autonomous subject, to self-consciousness, to an enlightenment painfully aware of its own potentials for barbarism. This always involved a certain suspension or suspicion with regards to the passage to unreflected praxis. And this remained the casus belli in Adorno's criticisms of the student movement, for what he called, in a striking phrase, its barren and brutal practicism. Before returning briefly to Adorno's most provocative criticism of this practicism, I want to think about the historical and material context in which the question of the university as a political space and pedagogy as democratic can be posed. Yes, Jason?
It's okay. It was going again, but I think I feel like we're holding on just about.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's a matter. I think it's just a matter of my signal here.
It may well be. The mic's good, so you can go as close as you need. I think it's.
Okay. All right. Okay. Very schematically, among the principal drivers of the first global cycle of student revolts was a contradiction between the sociological democratization of universities, the selective integration into higher education of strata hitherto shut out of the sector, in keeping with the mutations of the labor market and national economic policies, and, on the other hand, the feudal character of power and privilege within these institutions. So if we cast a glance at the demands of the pre-68 student movements, we can see the strong presence of a broadly social democratic ideology of citizenship, founded on labor and the collective good, mediated by appropriate forms of delegation and representation. A radical reformist vision of student participation in the forms of decision, university governance, for instance, and the intellectual content, curricula, the definition of disciplines, was a fitting and imminent critique of the paternalist and technocratic discourse that accompanied the emergence of the mass university, certainly in Europe. Just as the wielders of the levers of power have invariably preferred theirs to be a managed democracy, to use that Putinesque term, so forms of self-management and autonomy have arisen by way of resistance. And when autonomy, maturity, and critical reasoning are components of the ideology of an institution, today we could perhaps add creativity, innovation, and even radicalism, it is not surprising that some of its inhabitants might over-identify with these principles. Now, if we extrapolate some commonalities from the cycle of university struggles in the years around 1968, it is possible to note how quickly any vision of an internal participatory reform of universities in a democratizing direction was abandoned. In the face of entrenched authoritarianism, in many ways a key target of those movements, but also the political demands posed by subjects, spaces, and struggles beyond the university, anti-imperialist liberation movements, radical worker struggles, feminism, radical black and minority movements, but also battles in the bosom of other authoritarian institutions, from the army to mental asylums. Brief as it may have been, however, the moment between the frustrated wish for participation and the abandonment of the university as a strategic or even as a tactical domain of struggle remains rich with experiment and lessons, though not the kind to be simply transposed into the present, not that they could be. In and against was the spirit of experiences like the Kritische Universität in Berlin or the Università Negativa in Trento, experiences that are partly capable of combining the critique and transformation of educational content and educational form, taking the politically necessary time and space to do so. The question of power here served as the hinge between politics in the university, politics against the university, and politics beyond the university. Just as it is well-nigh impossible to make antagonistic or emancipatory use of spaces and times without some practice of power, however organized, so the very act of posing the question of power seems of necessity to push the politicization of the university beyond its physical and institutional limits.
Maybe just a quick pause there, Alberto, just again.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's just, it's a kind of wave, it's coming and going. I think, can people hear, more or less, it's on the kind of edge, isn't it, of being decipherable. I'm just wondering whether we could try and drop the link and send you another link at that point. What do you think, Sungjae? Do you want to try and drop this link and send Alberto another link?
I'm happy to try, whatever works. Can you hear me fine now?
We can hear you fine now. It's it's okay like that. But when you actually when you're actually speaking in longer sentences, it kind of. What do you think? Yeah. The streaming is no. It might be Alberto's end. We could keep going, Alberto. If you can maybe, what might help it, if you have a volume control on that mic, that might get over it. Just to maybe turn it up slightly, or if not, just bring the mic slightly closer to you. Because I mean, all the sound is there. It's just it goes sort of high and low.
Okay. Let me just check on my. Maybe on my settings. The issue is that, I mean, the mic has a volume, but it's just the volume of what I hear, right? I tweaked the gain a little bit. Let me see. So we want my output. The output volume is all the way up, so I can't change that.
It sounds okay now, right? I think we're gonna just fingers crossed. We've got more or less all of your sound. It's just the kind of waves are kind of up and down, and it's. But yeah, let's just keep going. I think. Yeah, sure. Let's try.
All right. Okay, I will do, and I'm close enough. I think it probably should work. So the question of power here served as a hinge between politics and university, against the university, and beyond the university. Just as it is well nigh impossible to make antagonistic or emancipatory use of spaces and times without some practice of power, however organized, so the very act of posing the question of power seems of necessity to push the politicization of the university beyond its physical and institutional limits. The fate of the powerful watchword student power testifies to this. In the preface of the eponymous 1969 collection, sponsored by the then very young editors of the New Left Review, the tensions, impasses, and potentials in this slogan were duly registered. And I quote from that volume. But all these impulses for militancy or moderation are manifestations of the revolution from below, along with hastily convened action committees, the discussion, the necessity, both in practical and psychological terms, to control everything from lectures to telephones to catering. All the more reason for the militants in this atmosphere to keep their heads. Total control for a week or a month does not equal the capitulation of the enemy, but it does not mean when he has that control was useless or that the confrontation of the system on their own ground by students was a vain thing. Now, this commendable strategic aim to, in Leninist parlance, create something like a dual power in the university was, some might say, of necessity short-lived, with some rushing to the eventual aim of revolution and others retaking the path of piecemeal demands within the institution. In its student component, political action in universities appears thus as twice ephemeral. It rests on a relatively rapid turnover in its collective basis, as well as on the timing of teaching terms, exams, etc. That is to say, the student body is in rapid change, let's say, as compared to the body of a factory or an office. And it is drawn in no small part as an institution which in its radical variance strives to map the social totality beyond itself, to tackle greater authorities, to merge into broader struggles. The sociological imagination of the students at Nanterre, who were among the catalysts of the Parisian May, revealed as much. When they wrote, the unit of reference, the university is not viable.
Alberto, let's drop it and try and
Sure.
we'll send you a link again. Let's drop it and see if we can approach it like that. Okay.
No problem.
Okay, just one sec.
Okay.
Yep, we got you. We're still streaming. Let's just one sec. We'll just get your image on there. Yeah, we have him.
Should I backtrack a few sentences?
We're at Nanterre.
Okay.
We're at Nanterre.
Okay. As stated then in the declaration Why Sociologists by Daniel Cohn-Bendit, Jean-Pierre Duteuil, and Bernard Granotier at Nanterre, the unit of reference, the university, is not viable. The contradictions occur on the level of society as a whole, and the university is implicated in them. Conversely, the power of Herbert Marcuse's anti-imperialist rejoinders to Adorno's deep skepticism about the student movement, one element of Adorno's critique of student practicism remains vital to a thoughtful engagement with the university's anti-capitalist potentials then and now, namely what he refers to as the threat of technocratization. For Adorno, critical theory's dialectical sensitivity could allow one to grasp and hopefully preempt the manner in which a seemingly intransigent opposition to the university as a site for capitalist reproduction and bourgeois ideology could perversely contribute to the intensification of some of the worst tendencies within the domain of education. As Adorno wrote in a letter to Marcuse, dialectic means, amongst other things, that ends are not means. What is going on drastically demonstrates, right down to the smallest details, such as the bureaucratic clinging to agendas, binding decisions, countless committees, and such like, the features of just such a technocratization that they claim they want to oppose and which we actually oppose. But for all the analogies and continuities, if not in practices, then at least in the challenges faced, to reflect in the wake of critical theory on the possibility of democracy in the university today is also to confront a situation that harbors different potentials and throws up different limits to egalitarian and emancipatory collective action than the ones registered by previous movements. Most importantly, perhaps, the powers we face are of a different nature. Although the authority and ideology of a paternalistic state is not yet wholly defunct, it is now relayed by forms of control and measurement that take market competition as their model and use financial compulsion as their instrument, be it in shaping the university as a wannabe corporation or in disciplining students to their prospective working lives via debt. With the by now familiar and perverse irony of neoliberal governmentality, which banks on the idea of the individual as an entrepreneur of their inalienable but thoroughly alienated property, their human capital, the further restructuring and defunding of universities advertises itself as a new way of implementing, quote, the power of students to determine the structure and the content of their education. In the words of the Brown Review that helped to shape the current landscape of university education in the United Kingdom, our proposals put students at the heart of the system. Popular higher education institutions, HEIs, will be able to expand to meet student demand. Students will be better informed about the range of options available to them. Their choices will shape the landscape of higher education. The Student Power 2.0 that this and such like documents convey is a remarkable lesson in contemporary alienation. While collectively deprived of any meaningful power and individually consigned to precariousness and anxiety, in their statistical existence as selective consumers, students are now sovereign subjects. Thus, in the democracy of market competition, it makes perfect sense to posit that the student's choice, for instance, not to face the burden of suffocating levels of debt, may democratically imply the disappearance of numerous institutions, study places, and jobs. In this sense, the consumer people will have chosen. If we take into consideration the truly anthropological impact of the commodification of subjectivity and its neoliberal management, the pervasiveness of entrepreneurial models of the self, and the social ban on collective solidarity, there is something pretty inspiring in the capacity of many members of this ephemeral class that is not a class, but spends a lot of time in classes, to rebel against their empowerment by advocates of consumer power. Some credit, of course, should be given to the crisis and the consequent cracks in the shiny veneer of capitalist realism. That the ideology of the consumer subject is a vast existential Ponzi scheme is beginning to dawn on many. But to see in this a re-edition of a lived experience of no future, such as one may have encountered in the late 70s or 80s, would be insufficient. That is, unless we regard this mobilization of students for demands that in many cases will make no difference to them personally, as the formation of a solidarity between those who have no future, except one encompassed by debt and by the near total absence of collective control, spaces and times of everyday life. If we wish to insist on the idea of democracy, this democratic content, collective egalitarian solidarity, and the imperative to take some measures of control over the conditions of social reproduction against the illusions of personal choice, and perhaps even of autonomy, takes precedence over democratic form. By precedence, I do not mean that organizational and procedural questions fall by the wayside, but that instead of being fetishistically treated as solutions in their own right, they come to be shaped by the attempt to have done with the individuated consumer, discovering forms of action determined by common needs and solidarities. In other words, to quote Gilles Dauvet and Karl Nezich, the problem is not that of finding how to decide in common what we do, but how to do that which can be the object of common decisions, and no longer to do that which can only escape those who do it. It is all the more vital then to foster and inhabit spaces of intellectual exchange not beholden to the dictates of performance and productivity that increasingly pervade academic life, creating situations that are removed from the instrumentalization of inquiry. Whether this means the constant demand to validate one's work in terms of its value added or impact for sundry so-called stakeholders, or the more molecular compulsion to incessant self-promotion and mimetic self-advertisement or retweeting. While defensive guerrilla actions to protect what remains of the university as a critical space remain imperative, it is increasingly difficult to envisage it as a possible object of or milieu for common decisions, properly speaking. The university may be in ruins, as Bill Reddings diagnosed a quarter century ago, but those ruins are everywhere. The residua are not residual, but emergent, even hegemonic, not just in the planetary saturation and increasing homogeneity of the institutional and ideological form of the university, but in the way modes of discourse, competition, and self-promotion seeded and reproduced by academia exert such shaping pressure on our increasingly claustrophobic, socially mediated political horizon. The question then may be, to adapt the subtitle of one of the last books by the great communist critic Franco Fortini, Extrema ratio, the reason of extremes or the rationality of endings, that of a good use of ruins. Here we may take inspiration from an unlikely source, on which I conclude. In his 1796 letter to a noble lord, the great reactionary Edmund Burke waxed catastrophic about what he called the chemists of the Red Republic across the Channel. Those who, he wrote, consider mortar as a very anti-revolutionary invention in its present state, but properly employed an admirable material for overturning all establishments. They have found that the gunpowder of ruins is far the fittest for making other ruins, and so on ad infinitum. They have calculated what quantity of matter convertible into nitre is to be found in Bedford House, in Woburn Abbey, and in what His Grace and his trustees have still suffered to stand of that foolish royalist Inigo Jones in Covent Garden. Churches, playhouses, coffee houses, all alike are destined to be mingled and equalized and blended into one common rubbish, and well sifted and lixiviated to crystallize into true democratic, explosive, insurrectionary nitre. Their academy, that is to say the academy of the chemists of the Red Republic, has computed that the brave sans-culotte may make war on all the aristocracy of Europe for a 12-month out of the rubbish of the Duke of Bedford's buildings. What kind of war, then, may we ask, can be waged with the rubbish of the university? This is one of the questions we may want to dwell on and tarry with. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We got there. This is a really kind of fascinating. I mean, there's several ways I think any discussion might go now, we're kind of spoilt for choice here. But are there any questions here? I'm looking online, and okay, we do have a question. From Sungjae is asking, Adorno and Gramsci cited education as key to remove hegemony and bourgeois ideology and reform society. Do you think the reform of the educational system is also a key to changing the absurdity of capitalism in its modern society? And I wonder if Adorno and Gramsci's logic is also valid in modern society. Slightly
vast question. I suppose the first point to make might be to stress, for the purposes of answering the question, the differences, right? The differences in moment, but also in outlook between Gramsci and Adorno. And that might then lead us to think about the long history of conceptions of education or of pedagogy or of study that had as their institutions of reference, not of reverence, but of reference, institutions other than the university, or indeed institutions other than schools organized either by the state or by private charters and such like bodies, right? So, I mean, of course, in Gramsci's sense, it's not just the party, the so-called modern prince, that takes on a whole cognitive and educational function. It is that through which one maps the totality of social relations and acts upon them. But there's a whole thinking and practice, right? Indeed, especially, of course, before Gramsci's captivity, of different practices of workers' education, right? So one of the sites of education for Gramsci was the newspaper, the political newspaper. Famously, Gramsci took great care over pages of L'Ordine Nuovo, where workers would send in, stories, accounts, their experiences, and Gramsci would be this kind of pedagogue editor, right? Not quite a kind of Rancierian figure, but nevertheless, there's a lot of interesting sort of social historical work about those practices. And then, of course, we can think of the reading group, right? There's some excellent work done by an author whose name I think is Catherine Feely, on working class reading groups, right, in the 1920s and 30s in Northern England, right, where workers would get together and read Dietzgen, read editions of Marx, and think of them as integral to not just their political militancy, but their sort of everyday life. So I think that kind of expansion, right, of the domain of what counts as education or study, and of course, this is a theme that is obviously part and parcel of most movements, most collective movements, and also of a lot of contemporary reflection, right? I'm thinking of Harney's and Moten's book, The Undercommons, this kind of various ideas of that which exceeds the space of the university as an institution. Adorno's situation, Adorno's perspective, of course, is different, and it's different not least because of both a perceived and a real ebb or indeed collapse, right, of those institutions of self organization and self education. and therefore, and also from very early on, for reasons of expediency, even the institute itself, right, has to hitch itself to various already existing institutions, whether it's Columbia University in the late 30s and 40s during exile, University of Frankfurt, etc., and even its own autonomy, of course, has some very crass material parameters, not least, money coming from investments in wheat markets in Argentina and the like, right? So those are some of the issues at stake. I think one of the things I suppose I was suggesting, and I think one can do so via Gramsci, one can do so via Adorno, one can do so through other sources, is not to engage in a kind of facile iconoclastic move, which would just be to say, well, real education or real pedagogy must of necessity take place outside the university walls, right? But I think it is important analytically to distinguish various concepts, right? Education or research, for that matter, or study, and the issue, and the very historically and materially and geographically specific issue of the university and its critique. And I think maybe one of the problems, one of the issues, and I'm sure a lot of people are also tackling in this series of manifestos and workshops, etc., is whether one can cleave apart or tease apart the political and material institutional debates from the huge symbolic load, the freight that the very notion of the university, of the universitas, of the universal carries, right? And also the deep attachments and fantasies, right? Like, I think that's the other aspect that one has to think through and perhaps traverse, right? The way in which a lot of seemingly concrete or empirical or political debates about the university are entangled with some fairly intractable fantasies about the site of universality, the site of Bildung, the site of intellectual mastery, or what have you.
Thank you. Would you like to come up, Yanis? Yeah. No, there's no, I mean, technically we are absolutely stranded. Has to be very
stranded. In what sense?
He will explain later.
Okay, that's fine.
Thank you very much for the talk, which I really enjoyed. My name is Yannis Stelidis. I'm in the College of International Studies.
Nice to meet you.
I have a question, but before I ask it, I need to make sure I got this right. Your assumption or your presumption is that the space, the concept of the university, if we put it on an axis from top to bottom, the students are essentially at the bottom, and it is an inherently leftist concept, right? And it is being transformed because of pressures that come from top down. Have I understood it well? Partly, or perhaps mainly.
Sorry, what is an intrinsically leftist concept?
Because from what I understood, or the way that I understood it, is because this is where change happens, because this is what it allows for change, because this is what it allows for revolutions, this is what allows for mobilization. So it's kind of the space where a lot of the primarily leftist, I'm not accusing them, I'm just putting labels.
Yeah, that's fine.
This was, again, the way that I have understood your talk is that this was our kind of like our last chance to have a go against or at all those super capitalist or wild capitalist authoritative tendencies towards the whole of society, not just the university. Have I understood that right?
Okay. Yeah, yes and no. I suppose I was, in a sense, intending more to convey a perception, a theoretical perception, and a political perception from a particular phase of the 60s and 70s, which is not necessarily an ahistorical or general conviction of my own, right? Like what I wanted to identify was a moment whose legacies we still live with, even though we live in a very different moment. A moment in which universities were perceived as a lever or a catalyst, a seed bed, an incubator, whatever you want to call it, for broader progressive, emancipatory, radical, or revolutionary transformations, right? But what I did also want to do, and this might, maybe I'm anticipating a little bit where you're going, if I sense where you're going, but one of the things that I wanted to also identify, and that was my kind of plea in favor of Adorno's maligned, understandably maligned resistance to the student movement, was an insight that he had about the ways in which a certain form of radicalism that had the university was generating or reproducing broader patterns of transformations in power, what he called this kind of technocratization, that now has taken, you could argue, quite a much more virulent form, right? So that, and I think that top-bottom thing is now quite peculiar, because in some sense, the parameters for authority are still generated, you could say, to a certain extent, top-down, but they are mobilized in a way also from below, right? So you are also, in some sense, as a lecturer, as an educator, whatever we want to call ourselves, also increasingly policed through and by students in a state of kind of semi-autonomy, right? Whether as consumers or as just kind of subjects of disappointment, or as politicized students who want their curriculum changed, but not quite in the way that they wanted their curriculum changed in the 60s, etc. And I think that horizon of technocratization, of protocols and procedures and committees, has now pervaded a lot of the mobilization within and outside the university. And I guess that's kind of what I was sort of suggesting, and that's why I was kind of trying to indicate that there's a real, viewed from 2021, or already from 2010 or 11, there's a real ambiguity in the very notion of student power, right? Because that's in a sense what, so to speak, neoliberal university reforms, certainly in the United Kingdom, where I was until recently, were in the name of, right? They were in the name of not student power, of course, in the revolutionary sense, but student power in the choice, autonomy, and agency sense, right? So it's that kind of ambiguity that I think we need to confront.
But that is precisely, okay, now that we've got that out of the way, that is precisely how I think we should allow ourselves to not just view it, but let it be. If you're going to give choice to somebody, they are free to choose. We can't tell them, look, we're going to give you the freedom to choose, but make sure you choose right. I mean, we have the European Union for that. They do it all the time to states. And okay?
Yes.
But on that point, there's 3 points.
Choice under constraint, yes.
Exactly. There's three points that I think need to be raised. One is precisely that. What makes us think that students want to be educated? Yeah, students in the 60s, they wanted certain things, but that is precisely the context. We are missing the context of now, and the context of now is marketization. The context of now is people wanting a piece of paper, and it's not just now, it has been obviously for quite a lot many years. But the context of now is people need a piece of paper that they can then show to someone else so that they can start earning a salary and putting food on the table, okay? In much the same the same way in terms of context. I feel there's you as in your talk, you personally, and everybody else who, or most people who engage in this kind of the critique or lamentation of what the university used to be, but is not anymore. Well, let's go back, because you spoke about universitas, right? You spoke about, or you implied, this lost prestige of the university, and my mind goes back to the 1700s and the 1600s. How many people do we know from these years that excelled in knowledge? We have, obviously, we have certain cases. We have a lot of philosophers slash mathematicians slash doctors slash artists, superb minds. But the fact that there were only a few of them compared to how many people at that time joined the university shows us precisely this, that not everybody can learn, or that not everybody is willing to excel in learning. And the last point that I want to make is, again, something that slightly pisses me off. Well, it depends what day it is, but I find it enraging that we, in our engagement with critical theory, we are being critical again towards the students, but we are not being critical towards us. We had this kind of a conversation with, what was his name, Adam? A.J. Bartlett, yeah, a few weeks ago. What do I mean by that? You are a reader. I recently became a professor and I got tenure. Jason is going to be in these shoes next year. And it feels nice, I have to admit. Not monetarily, not yet, but I'm hoping that it will turn out nice as well. But we pretend to be educators, and we like to call ourselves as genuine pedagogues or whatever it is. But we don't say no thank you to the university that says, would you like a little bit of a promotion? Would you like to become reader? Would you like to get tenure? We never go back and say, who cares about these things? All I care about is educating the students. All I care about is having 3, 5, 10 out of my 50 students every semester. When they leave my class, they think in a completely different way than when they first joined. Does that make sense? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I definitely. So there's a lot there. So I'm going to try to tease apart those questions and or bring them together. Maybe just because it's fresher in mind. The last point. No, I don't actually have any. Well, I guess one is always nostalgic for things that one. I was about to say, there's nothing I'm particularly nostalgic for in terms of my own trajectory. Right? It's not like I think, oh, the golden days of 2006 or whatever, right? But I don't know. I don't, and it's unfortunate if I gave that impression. But no, I don't have any particular hankering for some previous iteration of the university, and we could list all the reasons why there's not necessarily that much to be nostalgic about. Indeed, one could go further than what you were saying about the 16th and 17th century. Actually, very large numbers, until relatively recently, of towering figures in philosophy or indeed in the sciences had very little to do with actual universities as institutions, or had at best tangential relationships to them. I would disagree with you on the. So on one level, yes, the university is just a site for the sorting and triage of wage workers or wageless people, or indebted or credited youth, and in that sense, we are just and I think it's true that there's that kind of symbolic, sublime notion of the university that allows a lot of people to tell themselves very strange stories about what they're doing, right? What they're doing when they're grading papers, what they're doing, which is not necessarily contributing to the life of the mind, but sort of making a mild tweak on the far edges of the job market is probably more like it. That said, and maybe I'm less negative about students than one might appear. I actually think there's like remarkably contradictory, not in some kind of virtuous dialectical sense, just in the kind of very banal everyday sense, like contradictory drives and motivations and experiences at stake in the university. So one of the things that I find interesting is how much work, for instance, in the United Kingdom, has to be done by these regulatory bodies to try to get people not to take courses in the humanities, right? And not to get, you know, like given the fact that you'll all be in debt for, you know, £40,000 or whatever, and given that in what is, you know, I guess from certain perspectives is still a relatively benevolent system, even though it's not, but like you only pay it back once you start making a wage. They had this problem, right? Like in some sense, the system in the United Kingdom is set up to replicate what at a certain point was a kind of ideal of a lot of, you know, let's say lefty philosophy students, right? It's like living on the dole forever. In a sense, you still could do that, right? Like you get into a philosophy program, you get into debt, but if you never make more than £22,000 a year, which is incidentally £6,000 more than the average wage or whatever in the UK, you'll never have to pay it back. What's interesting to me is that was never perceived like it would have been in the 1980s as a sort of condition that the state was providing that you could game and live with. Is just perceived as debt, right? No, there isn't, and I know from my students, right? There isn't a kind of discourse or a perception of like, oh, cool, I'm going to go for university for free. I know I won't make a lot of money. And you know, I'm getting my degree paid for, and I'll just study whatever Leibniz or Badiou and whatnot. That's just not the case, and I think that that then leads us to, I guess, trying to think maybe with a bit more nuance, right, about like what what the experience or the subjectivity is that is both that the universities are both trying to format in a certain way. So like trying to format the student to be this kind of agential consumer who takes the right courses that will raise their income. That's what the state is trying to game the system to do. And then the students are never quite doing what the state really wants them to do. But then again, they also don't necessarily have a very clear idea. And that's, I guess, you know, maybe following on from your suggestion, that's why it's also, I think, you know, universities are peculiar as workplaces, right? Because we are, you know, waged workers of a sort, or salaried workers, because of the very, like the constant disavowal that it's a place where you make a wage, but also the real confusion, like as I think you were rightly indicating, about the motivations and at stake, right? So, and I think, you know, at times there's, at times one is tempted to be quite crude about it, right? Just to put forward like what we're doing and what, you know, what this is kind of for. But then, you know, at other times there is I mean, not to be too like rosy tinted about it, but I think there's something that I found, you know, occasionally inspiring, or at the very least interesting, about the fact that after, you know, that the students who have been totally born into the system, right, like who didn't know anything else, for some reason, still like either didn't want to or couldn't occupy the space, the slot that was set out there for them. Like, and in some sense, I guess it's the failure of the creation of the sort of student consumer is I'm not saying it's like a reason for hope or whatever, it's not necessarily, but it's an interesting problem, right? And certainly viewed up close in the United Kingdom, I found that quite striking, like, but that said, not in any particular direction, right? As a kind of space of being in this institution that can only survive if it has all sorts of fantasies about itself in some sense, and that can never really implement its transformation. And that's why maybe, just to finish on that, one of the things then looking more at not just the lectures, but let's say the management, right? One of the things that found very striking and also limited maybe about the idea of a neoliberal university is that there's a massive amount of simulation and play acting going on, right? Like the managers of universities, maybe because of their skill set or whatever, like a lot of times play at what they imagine a business is like, right? Like, so there's a lot of, I think it would be mistaken to think that we live in these institutions where like some very lucid neoliberal machine is being applied. Actually, there's a lot of, as if there's a lot of play acting. There's a lot, even these kind of punitive managerial measures are often done by people who like literally do not know what they're doing, right? They might fire people, they might generate austerity. And, maybe this is also true much higher up the food chain, but that's also the effect. And I think that's what's most striking to me is the fact that at the level of the management of the lecturers and of the students, that kind of ambiguity and being stuck between the kind of material reproduction of the institution and then this sort of symbolic level is quite peculiar, and it is different for various reasons. I think that it might have been before, not necessarily again in a way that one needs to be nostalgic for, right? Not least like in my own experience. I mean, I got a relatively permanent job at a university like in my late 20s, like which would have been certainly in Italy or wherever was like it's still kind of radically impossible, right? So in some sense, like the state university where you have tons of time, etc., is not necessarily an object of nostalgia if it's a fiefdom that you will never have your way in, right? So I'm quite conscious of all the ambiguities you're rightly pointing out.
Grazie mille, fratello.
Prego.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Yanis and Alberto. I feel like we're hearing Alberto so well now, and do we have any more questions? This is our kind of last chance, right? Are we still? Did I speak too soon? We dropped the link.
No, I'm here.
Are you here? You're still here. Sorry, your image vanished, and I was just famous last words, right? I was spooking you. They're spooking the connection. We have. Someone else. Okay. Can I just maybe ask one? I think this question that's come up on YouTube is pretty. You pretty exhaustively answered that actually. So do we have anyone else here with a question? Because we have people here, right? But no one wants to ask a question. Did you have time for one more, Alberto?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, sure. What I found really interesting, kind of following on from Yanis's question, but to return to this idea of student power and the characterization of Adorno, which you gave in the paper, which kind of got me thinking. I mean, that's not really how we're used to seeing Adorno, right? And especially not in the context of '68. I mean, Adorno as a critical theorist, rather than a kind of theoretical practitioner, let's say, right? It's not really, it's not someone we associate with '68. And as far as the student rebellion goes, the student uprisings of '68, particularly in France, he's old school, right? I mean, I suppose you could compare him with Althusser in that sense, right? That he kind of belongs to an older generation that the students were rightfully rebelling against, and
and he called the cops onto campus, right? That's the big.
Well, exactly. But but this is kind of like how we might like to characterize, critical theory. It didn't have the kind of affirmative direct action You know, it wasn't, you know, it didn't have the kind of vibrancy and the enthusiasm and the practicism, I think is a term that you used in your talk. It wasn't practical, it wasn't experimental enough, it was quite conservative. But I mean, if we look at this, and of course with the passage of time and with the benefit of hindsight, maybe we should have been, or maybe the students might wanted to have been a little bit more like Adorno than they were prepared to be, actually. It's quite an interesting characterization where you could say, okay, the Maoists, you know, if only Badiou had been a little bit more critical in his thinking, a little bit more reticent and patient, let's say. I mean, that's maybe, I don't know if you find that a fair characterization. I'm kind of stereotyping people.
I mean, I think, finish.
So if only we had been more patient, if only student power had kind of waited, you know, had been a bit more like the kind of, you know, Malm, right? I mean, Badiou's kind of, I'm wondering how Badiou's, you know, later work fits onto that kind of moment of 68. You know, if only we'd waited, if only we'd been more patient, then the kind of progressive changes that the students had been aiming for might kind of have come about eventually. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if the issue is one of haste, or maybe if the more fruitful way of approaching it is in terms of a sensibility that Adorno has, which could be compared, though it's by no means analogous to the famous bon mot by Lacan, you know, you're just looking for a master. The sort of sensibility for that which in the attitudes, the subjectivity, and you could say even the imaginaries and forms of power, right? So we go back to the kind of student power, right? Like, so, you know, if the students are in power, it's not, the issue is, has that power changed, right? Like, or is there a kind of intractable imaginary and indeed, or fantasy, or indeed practice of power that is kind of carried along with it, right? So, and in some sense, you could, I mean, somewhat churlishly, you could argue that there's like a deficit of a certain feature of the Maoist palette, i.e. the self-criticism, right? Like there's a kind of, the Adorno's line is not just, well, there's two lines. One is more in those exchanges with Marcuse, it's more that in the absence of a kind of worked out and organizationally worked out political project, there's a sort of hysterical drive towards confrontation, so that basically the students want the cops to evict them from the university because that will be a sign that they have done something radical, because it's not clear that they can establish the radicalism on their own terms. And that might also kind of resonate with the Lacan line. And the other one is, I guess, the idea that unbeknownst to themselves, they are the kind of vanishing mediators of a dismantling of a no longer functional of a conservative university, which is conservative in the sense of valuing whatever, research, the humanities, blah, 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 and that they are, in a sense, a kind of vanishing mediator, or even a sort of unconscious wedge that will then allow the technocratization of the university, right? So you could see Adorno writing in the late 60s, also anticipating a discourse that becomes much more prominent in the late 70s, where someone like Régis Debray, for instance, writing in the New Left Review in the late 70s, will say, well, you know, what was 68? Well, 68 was, again, like unwittingly or unconsciously, something that allowed, you know, an acceleration, an aggiornamento of French society and French capitalism that was weighted with all of these anachronistic, right? Social mores and regressive ideas and related institutions, and in some sense, the explosion allowed, it's like move fast and break things, right? Like it allowed this kind of recombination that was then, then allowed kind of France to become more like the U.S., right? You could say, to put it really crassly, also in terms of Debray's rather negative obsession with Americanism and so on. So that's like one way, I suppose, in which one could read, right, those arguments about technocratization as a deficit of critical historical understanding of the students, of knowing where they found themselves, right? It's like where they found themselves on this arc. And in some way, you could say that, and this is the character also of Adorno and even Horkheimer, even at their conservative, is that they're still wielding, right, like the critique of political economy. In the case of Adorno, he's still talking about, like quite late on, about the brilliance of Lenin's State and Revolution as a political text or whatever. Like they're still wielding, those critiques against a certain radicalism to argue about its lack of reflexivity, about its role, right? And I think one of the reasons that I thought it, going against the grain of like, Marcuse was so much better than Adorno, about which politically I kind of broadly in some generic sense agree, but I wanted to sort of kind of highlight that moment because I do think that element, and I think I perceived, right, in terms of also not the student mobilizations of 2010 and 11, but stuff that's been happening after that, in terms of things like curricula, in terms of certain demands made of the university, that there's that technocratizing motivation or mode is very present in a lot of what kind of passes for, right, like for student radicalism. So, and there's an inability to separate the moment of critique of the university from the imminent technocratic proceduralist moment. The result of which is, you will have a political mobilization in the university around things that are, sacrosanct and entirely necessary, like forms of discrimination, neglect of issues of mental health of students, structures of racism, and so on and so forth. And the result will be a result which is quite palatable to the university, which will be to generate new forms of auditing and procedure, right? Where like the students are then used to sort of govern the staff, or they're just viewed as kind of like politically, like the form is a form of the student consumer, but with the content of a kind of political radicalism, which does nothing but generate more 7-hour PowerPoint sessions about how to correct your behavior, or more committees and audits, and does nothing to transform the everyday life of the university. And I think in that sense, in that specific sense, those passages of Adorno in hindsight can be viewed as having a somewhat prophetic character.
Thanks very much. Yeah. The signal's getting really bad now. We've I think we've almost exhausted the power, and I suppose power, technical power is something we could have done with a little bit more during this conversation. But in terms of principles and concepts, we're taking off. It was it was pretty successful in that respect, but technical power was definitely something that we could have done with a bit more. But any final thoughts or questions for Alberto while we've still got him, while we've still got the power? Yeah? But, you've given us so much to think about there. We're going to keep on talking about this, Alberto, actually, the students and I. So
great.
Thanks ever so much. I mean, it's been great. It's
pleasure.
there was a moment there where, okay, we got you in the end. And yeah, thanks ever so much. We should do this again sometime, but for the moment, thanks ever so much for joining us, right? And
right, and good luck with the rest of the series.
Thanks ever so much. Join us again if you can, yeah. Thanks.
For sure. Ciao.
Ciao.